A truggle humper for the flesh lump eater. They is always 50 winks before they goes scrumping off to hunt human beings in the evening, the BFG said. He stopped for a few moments to let Sophie have a better look. Giants is only sleeping every then and now, he said. Not nearly as much as human beings. Human beings is crazy for sleeping. It is ever occurring to you that a human being who is 50 is spending about 20 years sleeping fast? I must admit, that never occurred to me, Sophie said. You should allow it to occur to you, the BFG said. Imagine it, please. The human being who says he is 50 has been fast asleep for 20 years and is not even knowing where he is, not even doing anything, not even thinking. It's a funny thought, Sophie said. Exactly, the BFG said. So what I is trying to explain to you is that a human being who says he is 50 is not 50, he is only 30. What about me? Sophie said. I am 8. You is not 8 at all, the BFG said. Human being babies and little childers is spending half their time sleeping. So you is only 4. I am 8, Sophie said. You may think you is 8, the BFG said, but you has only slept for 4 years of your life. With your little eyes open. You is only 4, and please stop higgling me. Titchy little snapper whippers like you should not be higgling around with an old sage and onions who is hundreds years more than you. How much do giants sleep? Sophie asked. They is never wasting much time snozzling, the BFG said. 2 or 3 hours is enough. When do you sleep? Sophie asked. Even less, the BFG answered. I is sleeping only once in a blue baboon. Sophie, peeping out from her pocket, examined the 9 sleeping giants. They looked even more grotesque now than when they were awake. Sprawled out across the yellow plain, they covered an area about the size of a football field. Most of them were lying on their backs with their enormous mouths wide open, and they were snoring like foghorns. The noise was awful. Suddenly, the BFG gave a jump in the air. By gum frog, he cried, I is having the most whoopee-whiffling idea. What? Sophie said. Wait, he cried. Hold your horse feathers. Keep your skirt on. Just you wait to see what I is about to bring about. He galloped off fast to his cave with Sophie hanging on tight to the rim of the pocket. He rolled back the stone. He entered the cave. He was very excited. He was moving quickly. You stay where you is in my pocket. Hugbee, he said, we is doing this lovely bit of bunk washing both together. He laid aside the dream-catching net, but hung on to the suitcase. He ran across to the other side of the cave and grabbed the long trumpet thing, the one he had been carrying when Sophie had first seen him in the village. With the suitcase in one hand and the trumpet in the other, he dashed out of the cave. What is he up to now? Sophie wondered. Keep your head up good, the BFG said. Then you will get a fine winkle of what is going on. When the BFG came near to the sleeping giants, he slowed his pace. He began moving softly. He crept on his toes towards the ugly brutes. They were still snoring loudly. They looked repulsive, filthy, diabolical. The BFG tiptoed around them. He went past the gizzard gulper, the blood bottler, and the meat dripper, and child chewer. Then he stopped. He had reached the flesh lump eater. He pointed at him, then looked down at Sophie and gave her a big wink. He knelt on the ground and very quietly he opened the suitcase. He took out of it the glass jar containing the terrible nightmarish troggle humper. At that point, Sophie guessed what was going to happen next. Ouch, she thought. This could be rather dangerous. She crouched lower in the pocket so that only the top of her head and her eyes were showing. She wanted to be ready to duck out of sight very fast should anything go wrong. They were about 10 feet away from the flesh lump eater's face. The snorting noise he was making was disgusting. Every now and again, a big bubble of spit formed between his 2 open lips, and then it would burst with a splash and cover his face with saliva. Taking infinite care, the BFG unscrewed the top of the glass jar and tipped the squiggling, squirming, faintly scarlet trogglehopper into the wide end of his long trumpet. He put the other end of the trumpet to his lips. He aimed the instrument directly at the flesh lump eater's face. He took a deep breath, puffed out his cheeks, then woof, he blew. Sophie saw a flash of pale red go darting towards the giant's face. For a split second, it hovered above the face. Then it was gone. It seemed to have been sucked up the giant's nose, but it had all happened so quickly, Sophie couldn't be sure. We had better be skittling away quick to where it is safe, the BFG whispered. He trotted off for about 100 yards, then stopped. He crouched low to the earth. Now, he said, we is waiting for the gun and flames to begin. They didn't have to wait long. The air was suddenly pierced by the most fearful roar Sophie had ever heard, and she saw the flesh lump eater's body, all 54 feet of it, rise up off the ground and fall back again with a thump. Then it began to wrinkle and twist and bounce about in the most violent fashion. It was quite frightening to watch. Ew, roared the flesh lump eater. Ay, ow! He's still asleep, the BFG whispered. The terrible troggle-humping nightmare is beginning to hit him. Serves him right, Sophie said. She could feel no sympathy for this great brute who ate children as though they were sugar lumps. Save us, screamed the flesh lump eater, thrashing about madly. He is after me. He's getting me. The thrashing of limbs and waving of arms became more violent by the second. It was an awesome thing to watch such a massive creature having such mighty convolutions. It's Jack, bellowed the flesh lump eater. It's the gruesome, gruful, grunchiest Jack. Jack is after me. Jack is whack-crackling me. Jack is spike-sticking me. Jack is splash-flunking me. It is the terrible fright-swiping Jack. The flesh lump eater was withering about over the ground like some colossal tortured snake. Oh, spare me, Jack, he yelled. Don't hurt me, Jack. Who is this Jack he's on about? Sophie whispered. Jack is the only human being all giants is frightened of, the BFG told her. They is absolutely terrified of Jack. They is all hearing that Jack is a famous giant killer. Save me, screamed the flesh lump eater. Have mercy on this poor little giant, the beanstalk. He's coming with me, at me with his terrible spike-sticking beanstalk. Take it away, I is begging you. Jack, I is praying you not to touch me with your terrible spike-sticking beanstalk. Us giants, the BFG whispered, is not knowing very much about this dreaded human being called Jack. We is knowing only that he is a famous giant killer, and that he is owing something called a beanstalk. We is knowing also that the beanstalk is a fearsome thing, and Jack is using it to kill giants. Sophie couldn't stop smiling. What is you giggling at? The BFG asked her, slightly nettled. I'll tell you later, Sophie said. The awful nightmare had now gripped the great brute to such an extent that he was tying his whole body into knots. Do not do it, Jack, he screeched. I was not eating you, Jack. I is never eating human beings. I swear I has never gobbled a single human being in my wholesome life. Liar, said the BFG. Just then, one of the flesh lump eater's flailing fists caught the still fast asleep, meat-dripping giant smack in the mouth. At the same time, one of his furiously thrashing legs kicked the snoring, gizzard-gulping giant right in the guts. Both injured giants woke up and leaped to their feet. He is swiping me right in the mouth, yelled the meat dripper. He is bung-swoggling me smack in the guts, shouted the gizzard-gulper. The two of them rushed at the flesh lump eater and began pounding him with their fists and feet. The wretched flesh lump eater woke up with a bang. He awoke straight from one nightmare into another. He roared into battle, and in the bellowing, thumping, rough and tumble that followed, one sleeping giant after another either got stepped upon or kicked. Soon, all 9 of them were on their feet, having the most almighty free-for-all. They punched and kicked and scratched and bit and butted each other as hard as they could. Blood flowed. Noses went crunch. Teeth fell out like hailstones. The giants roared and screamed and cursed, and for many minutes the noise of the battle rolled across the yellow plain. The BFG smiled a big wide smile of absolute pleasure. I is loving it when they is all having a good toughin' rumble, he said. They'll kill each other, Sophie said. Never, the BFG answered. Those beasts is always fishing and walloping at one another. Soon it will be getting dusky, and they will be galloping off to fill their tummies. They're coarse and foul, filthy, Sophie said. I hate them. As the BFG headed back to the cave, he said quietly, We certainly was putting that nightmare to good use, though, wasn't we? Excellent use, Sophie said. Well done, you. Dreams. The big friendly giant was seated at the great table in his cave, and he was doing his homework. Sophie sat cross-legged on the tabletop nearby, watching him work. The glass jar containing the one and only good dream they had caught that day stood between them. The BFG, with great care and patience, was printing something on a piece of paper with an enormous pencil. What are you writing? Sophie asked him. Every dream is having a special label on the bottle, the BFG said. How else could I be finding the one I am wanting in a hurry? But you can't really and truly tell what sort of dream is going to be by simply listening to it, Sophie asked. I can, the BFG said, not looking up. But how? Is it by the way it hums and buzzes? You is lesser more, right? The BFG said. Every dream in the world is making a different sort of buzzy hum music, and these grand, swashbuckling ears of mine is able to read that music. By music, do you mean tunes? I is not meaning tunes. Then what do you mean? Human beings is having their own music, right or left. Right, Sophie said. Lots of music. And sometimes human beings is very overcome when they is hearing wondrous music. They is getting shivers down their spindles, right or left. Right, Sophie said. So the music is saying something to them. It is sending a message. I do not think the human beings is knowing what the message is, but they is loving it just the same. That's about right, Sophie said. But because of these jump-squiffling ears of mine, the BFG said, I is not only able to hear the music that Dreams is making, but I is understanding it also. What do you mean, understanding it? Sophie said. I can read it, the BFG said. It talks to me. It's like a language. I find that a little hard to believe, Sophie said. I bet you is also finding it hard to believe in quagwinkles, the BFG said, and they is visiting us from the stars. Of course I don't believe that, Sophie said. The BFG regarded her gravely with those huge eyes of his. I hope you will forgive me, he said, if I tell you that human beings is thinking they is very clever, but they is not. They is nearly all of them not munchers and squeak pips. I beg your pardon, Sophie said. The matter with human beings, the BFG went on, is that they is absolutely refusing to believe in anything unless they is actually seeing it right in front of their own snozzles. Of course, quagwinkles is existing. I is meeting them oftenly. I is even chittering to them. He turned away contemptuously from Sophie and resumed his writing. Sophie moved over to read what he had written so far. The letters were printed big and bold, but were not very well formed. Here is what he said. This dream is about how I is saving my teacher from drowning. I is diving into the river from a high bridge, and I is dragging my teacher to the bank. And then I is giving him the kiss of death. The kiss of what? Sophie asked. The BFG stopped writing and raised his head slowly. His eyes rested on Sophie's face. I is telling you once before, he said quietly, that I is never having a chance to go to school. I is full of mistakes. They is not my fault. I do my best. You is a lovely little girl, but please remember that you is not exactly Miss Know-Everything yourself. I'm sorry, Sophie said. I really am. It is very rude of me to keep correcting you. The BFG gazed at her for a while longer. Then he bent his head again to his slow, laborious writing. Tell me honestly, Sophie said, if you blew his dream into my bedroom when I was asleep, would I really truly start dreaming about how I saved my teacher from drowning by diving off the bridge? More, the BFG said, a lot more, but I cannot be scribbling the whole grop-funkling dream on a titchy bit of paper. Of course there is more. The BFG laid down his pencil and placed one massive ear close to the jar. For about 30 seconds he listened intently. Yes, he said, nodding his great head solemnly up and down. This dream is continuing very nice. It has a very dory-hunky ending. How does it end? Sophie said. Please tell me. You would be dreaming, the BFG said, that the morning after you is saving the teacher from the river, you is arriving at school and you is seeing all the 500 pupils sitting in the assembly hall and all the teachers as well. And the head teacher is standing up and saying, I is wanting the whole school to give 3 cheers for Sophie, 'cause she is so brave and is saving the life of our fine arithmetic teacher, Mr. Figgins, who was unfortunately pushed off the bridge into the river by our gym teacher, Miss Amelia Upscotch. So 3 cheers for Sophie. And the whole school is then cheering like mad and shouting, Bravo, well done. And even after that, and forever after that, even when you was getting your sums all gog-swiggled and muggled up, Mr. Figgins is always giving you 10 out of 10 and writing good work, Sophie, in your exercise book. Then you is waking up. I like that dream, Sophie said. Of course you like it, the BFG said. It is a fizz wizard. He licked the back of the label and stuck it on the jar. I is usually writing a bit more than this on the labels, he said, but you is watching me and making me jumpsy. I'll go and sit somewhere else, Sophie said. Don't go, he said. Look at the jar carefully, and I think you'll be seeing this dream. Sophie peered into the jar, and there, sure enough, she saw a faint translucent outline of something about the size of a hen's egg. There was a touch of color in it, a pale sea green, soft and shimmering and very beautiful. There it lay, this small oblong sea green jellyfish thing at the bottom of the jar, quite peaceful but pulsing gently, the whole of it moving in and out ever so slightly, as though it were breathing. It's moving, Sophie cried. It's alive. Of course it's alive. What will you feed it on? Sophie asked. It is not needing food, the BFG told her. That's cruel, Sophie said. Everything alive needs food of some sort, even trees and plants. The north wind is alive, the BFG said. It is moving. It touches you on the cheek and on the hands, but nobody is feeding it. Sophie was silent. This extraordinary giant was disturbing her ideas. He seemed to be leading her towards mysteries that were beyond her understanding. A dream is not needing anything, the BFG went on. If it is a good one, it is waiting peacefully forever until it is released and allowed to do its job. If it's a bad one, it's always fighting to get out. The BFG stood up and walked over to one of the many shelves and placed the latest jar among the thousands of others. Please, can I see some of the other dreams? Sophie asked him. The BFG hesitated. Nobody is ever seeing them before, he said, but perhaps after all I is letting you have a little peep. He picked her up off the table and stood her on the palm of one of his huge hands. He carried her towards the shelves. Over here is one of the good dreams, he said, the fizz wizards. Would you hold me closer so I can read the labels, Sophie said. My labels is only telling bits of it, the BFG said. The dreams is usually much longer. The labels is just to remind me. Sophie started to read the labels. The first one seemed long enough to her. It went around the whole jar. And as she read it, she had to keep turning the jar. This is what it said. Today I is sitting in class, and I discover that if I is staring very hard at my teacher in a special way, I is able to put her to sleep. So I keep staring at her, and in the end, her head drops on her desk, and she goes fast to sleep and snorkles loudly. Then in marches the head teacher, and he shouts, Wake up, Miss Plumbridge, how dare you go to sleep in class? Go fetch your hat and coat and leave the school forever. You is sacked. But in a jiffy I is putting the head teacher to sleep as well, and he just crumples slowly to the floor like a lump of jelly, and there he lies all in a heap and starts snorkeling even louder than Miss Plumbridge. And then I is hearing my mommy's voice saying, Wake up, your breakfast is ready. What a funny dream, Sophie said. It's a ring beller, said the BFG. It's whoopsie. Inside the jar, just below the edge of the label, Sophie could see the putting to sleep dream laying peacefully at the bottom, pulsing gently, sea green like the other one, but perhaps a trifle larger. Do you have separate dreams for boys and girls? Sophie asked. Of course, the BFG said. If I was giving a girl's dream to a boy, even if it was really whoopsie girl's dream, the boy would be waking up and thinking what a boggling, grunk-scuggling old dream that was. Boys would, Sophie said. These here is all girls' dreams on this shelf, the BFG said. Can I read a boy's dream? You can, said the BFG, and he lifted her to a higher shelf. The label on the nearest boy's dream jar read as follows. I is making myself a marvelous pair of suction boots, and when I put them on, I is able to walk straight up the kitchen wall and across the ceiling. Well, I is walking upside down on the ceiling when my big sister comes in, and she is starting to yell at me, as she always does, yelling, "What on earth is you doing up there walking on the ceiling?" And I looks down at her and smiles, and I say, I told you was driving me up the wall, and now you has done it. I find that one rather silly, Sophie said. Boys wouldn't, the BFG said, grinning. It's another ring beller. Perhaps you has seen enough now. Let me read another boy's one, Sophie said. The next label said, The telephone rings in your house, and my father picks it up and says in his very important telephone voice, Simpson speaking. Then his face goes white and his voice goes all funny, and he says, What? Who? And then he says, Yes, sir, I understand, sir, but surely it is me you are wishing to speak to, sir, not my little son. My father's face is going from white to dark purple, and he is gulping like he has a lobster stuck in his throat. And then at last he is saying, Yes, sir, very well, sir, I will get him, sir. And he turns to me and he says, in a rather respectful voice, Is you knowing the President of the United States? And I says, No, but I expect he is hearing about me. Then I is having a long talk on the phone and says things like, Let me take care of it, Mr. President. You'll bungle it all up if you do it your way. And my father's eyes is goggling right out of his head, and that is when I is hearing my father's real voice saying, Get up, you lazy slob, or you will be late for school. Boys are crazy, Sophie said. Let me read this next one. Sophie started reading the label. I is having a bath, and I is discovering that if I press quite hard on my tummy button, a funny feeling comes over me, and my legs is not there, nor is my arms. In fact, I have become absolutely invisible all over. I is still there, but no one can see me, not even myself. So my mom comes in and says, Where is that child? He was in the bath a minute ago, and he can't possibly have washed himself properly. So I says, Here I is, and she says, Where? And I say, Here. And she says, Where? And I say, Here. And she yells, Henry, come up quick. And when my dad rushes in, I is washing myself, and my dad sees the soap floating around in the air, but of course he is not seeing me. And he shouts, Where are you, boy? And I say, Here. And he says, Where? And I say, Here. And he says, Where? And I say, Here. And he says, The soap, boy, the soap. It's flying in the air. Then I press my tummy button again, and now I is visible. My dad is swiftly with excitement, and he says, You is the invisible boy. And I say, Now I is going to have some fun. So when I is out of the bath and I have dried myself, I put on my dressing gown and slippers, and I press my tummy button again to become invisible, and I go into the town and walk into the streets. Of course, only me is invisible, but not the things I is wearing, so when people is seeing a dressing gown and slippers floating along the street with nobody in it, there's a panic with everybody yelling, A ghost, a ghost. And the people is screaming left and right. The big, strong policeman is running for their lives, and best of all, I see Mr. Grumpet, my algebra teacher, coming out of a pub, and I float up to him and say, Boo! And he lets out a frightsome howl and dashes back into the pub, and then I is waking up and feeling happy as a wiffle squibbler. Pretty ridiculous, Sophie said. All the same, she couldn't resist reaching down and pressing her tummy button to see if it worked. Nothing happened. Dreams is very mystical things, the BFG said. Human beings is not understanding them at all. Not even their brainiest professors is understanding them. Has you seen enough? Just this last one, Sophie said. This one here, she started reading. I has written a book and it is so exciting. Nobody can put it down. As soon as you has read the first line, you is so hooked on it you cannot stop until the last page in all the cities. People is walking in the streets, bumping into each other because their faces is buried in my book, and dentists is reading it and trying to fill the teeth at the same time, but nobody minds because they is all reading it too in their dentist chair. Drivers is reading it while driving, and cars are crashing all over the country. Brain surgeons is reading it while they are operating on brains, and airline pilots are reading it and going to Timbuktu instead of London. Football players are reading it on the field because they can't put it down, and so are Olympic runners while they are running. Everybody has to see what is going to happen next in my book. And when I wake up, I am still tingling with excitement at being the greatest writer in the world has ever known, until my mom comes in and says, I was looking at your English exercise book last night, and really your spelling is atrocious. So is your punctuation. That's enough for now, the BFG said. There is billions more, but my arm is getting tired holding you up. What are all those over there? Sophie said. Why have they got such tiny labels? That, the BFG said, is because one day I was catching so many dreams I was not having the time or energy to write out long labels. But there is enough to remind me. Can I look? Sophie said. The long-suffering BFG carried her across the jars she was pointing to. Sophie read them rapidly, one after another. I is climbing Mount Everest with just my pussycat for company. I is inventing a car that runs on toothpaste. I is able to make an electric light goes on and off by just wishing it. I is an 8-year-old little boy, but I is growing splendid bushy beard and all the other boys are jealous. I is able to jump off any high window and float down safely. I has a pet bee that makes rock and roll music when it flies. What amazes me, Sophie said, is how you ever learned to write in the first place. Ah, the BFG said, I has been wondering how long it is before you asked me that. Considering you never went to school, I think it's quite marvelous. Sophie said, how did you learn? The BFG crossed the cave and opened a tiny secret door in the wall. He took out a book, very old and tattered. By human standards, it was an ordinary-sized book, but it looked like a postage stamp in his huge hand. One night, he said, I is blowing a dream through a window, and I see a book lying on the little boy's bedroom table. I wanted it very badly, you understand, but I was refusing to steal it. I would never do that. So how'd you get it? Sophie asked. I borrowed it, the BFG said, smiling a little. Just for a short time I borrowed it. How long have you had it? Sophie asked. Perhaps only about 8 years, the BFG said. Soon I shall be putting it back. And that's how you taught yourself how to write? Sophie asked him. I is reading it hundreds of times, the BFG said, and I is still reading it and teaching new words to myself and how to write them. It is the most scrumdiddlyumptious story. Sophie took the book out of his hand. Nicholas Nickleby, she read out loud. By Doll's Chickens, the BFG said. By who? Sophie said. Just then there came a tremendous noise of galloping feet from outside the cave. What's that? Sophie cried. That's all the giants fizzling off to another country to guzzle up human beings, the BFG said. He quickly popped Sophie into his waistcoat pocket and hurried to the cave entrance and rolled back the stone. Sophie, peeping out of her spy hole, saw all 9 of the fearsome giants coming past at a full gallop. Where is you off to tonight? Shouted the BFG. We is all of us flesh bunking off to England tonight, answered the flesh lump eater. And they went galloping past. England is a luscious land, and we is fancying a few nice little English childers. I, shouted the maid masher, is knowing where there is a giggle house of girls, and I is guzzling myself full as a froth lower. "And I knows where there is a boggle box of boys," shouted the gizzard gulper. All I has to do is reach in and grab myself a handful. English boys is tasting extra liquishy. In a few seconds, the 9 galloping giants were out of sight. "What did he mean?" Sophie said, poking her head out of the pocket. "What is a giggle house for girls?" "He's meaning a girls' school," the BFG said. "He will be eating them by the bundle." "Oh, no," cried Sophie. "And boys from a boys' school," said the BFG. "It mustn't happen." Sophie cried out, "We've got to stop them. We can't just sit here and do nothing." "There's not a thing we can do," the BFG said. "We as helpless as horse feathers." He sat down on a large craggy blue rock near the entrance to his cave. He took Sophie from his pocket and put her beside him on the rock. "It is now quite safe for you to be outside until they is coming back," he said. The sun had dipped down below the horizon and it was getting dark.